as you know, this is a public debate, and what will happen is I'll open with Hillel Ticktin here, opening on the proposition, I'll find it in a minute. Did Trotsky point the way to socialism? And he'll be in the affirmative there. And then Adam Buick of the Socialist Party, he'll refute that and give his viewpoint. Then that'll be for a quarter of an hour each. And then they'll have 10 minutes each. And then after that, the meeting will be thrown open for approximately an hour for questions, points of view, any item that you want to raise appertaining to this question. And then each have 5 minutes to wind up. Now, I've been told by the library they're very, very keen in us vacating this very promptly at 5 o'clock. So I'm going to try and finish it at 5 o'clock. And I'm going to try and ensure that both speakers stick to that format to give the audience as much time as possible to put their point of view or to ask their question. So without me waffling on anymore, I'll call, first of all, on this one, did Trotsky point the way to socialism? Hillel Ticktin, the editor of Critique, will open on the affirmative of that debate. It's now just 3 o'clock, and he will speak to 1:15, and then Adam will reply for quarter of an hour. Okay, Hillel?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this debate. Well, I think we'll only get the actual debate going after we've both spoken. I do agree that Trotsky did point the way towards socialism, and that I would say is putting it mildly.
Could you speak up, please?
Okay. I do agree that Trotsky did point the way to socialism, and I think that's putting it mildly. And obviously, there's a series of points, a series of overall aspects which one has to deal with in that regard. Firstly, in regard to his life, he was a dedicated socialist, remained such until he was murdered by Stalin. Not many people have spent their whole lives in that way. Many people, as we know, begin as revolutionaries and end up as something quite else. Trotsky was dedicated, remained right through his life, even though it actually cost him his life and the life of his family. He was, as an intellectual, as a socialist intellectual, tolerant of differences, unlike certain socialists, unlike certain Bolsheviks. If you read what he wrote in various periods of his life, he remained true to that as well. Even in exile, when his fellow exile Otto Hüller made a critical comment of Freud, he supported Freud. As saying, if you remember what he wrote, or read what he wrote, what he said at the time was simply that one cannot criticize science in that way. He was tolerant at all times of different points of view, effectively. His depth of understanding of Marxism to a considerable degree was unsurpassed, although he never went for more than a few months to a higher educational institution. His understanding of dialectics was deep and shows in the way he wrote, quite apart from his actual exposition of dialectics. His understanding of political economy, again, he made very considerable contribution, which I still maintain. And his more general understanding of social relations within society, making one of the great Marxists. That's looking at it overall. Now, if one looks at his life, again, his action, he's really the hero's hero in organizing the victory of the Red Army. He didn't try and maintain or keep himself whole in the period. He fought and maintained the structure of the Red Army. To a considerable extent, the victory of the Bolsheviks was owed to him. There was, of course, the tragic hero killed by the other side, effectively, by Stalinism. I don't regard Stalin or actually Stalinism as part of the left. I think it is its own formation. It is not part of the left. It should never have been regarded as part of the left. It isn't part of the left. He was, of course, one of the leaders in 1917, or one of the major leaders, if not the major leader, one of the two. He was the leader, the deputy head of the Soviet in 1905, and in fact the real leader of 1905. And until somebody looks at his life in these terms, it's very. You could say he made many mistakes. All great leaders make mistakes. Of course, to learn from their mistakes. Of course, he made mistakes. Of course, one could discuss what his mistakes were. Nonetheless, he did fulfill this particular role, this very important role in the development of socialism. Well, then I think one has to look at a number of aspects, which I presume will be really much of a debate. Firstly, the question of the party. As we know, in 1904, he actually opposed Lenin very, very strongly, and I'm sure everybody knows that in great detail. The question, which I presume in part will be part of the debate, is exactly what attitude he took to the party. Well, I don't think that's very clear. In 1904, he took a very critical attitude towards Lenin's conception of the party, for being undemocratic, for demanding factory discipline over the members of the party. He explicitly and in detail opposed it. He remained outside the Bolshevik Party until July 1917, of course, and then joined it. Afterwards, Lenin said there was no better Bolshevik. However, the Bolsheviks never trusted him, as again was made very clear later. It's also very clear if you read his writings, particularly his last unfinished book on Stalin, that in fact he never really abandoned his suspicion of the Bolshevik Party. He remained all throughout critical of it, but he didn't actually expound that in the period from 1917 to 24/5. And in fact, he made various statements which appeared to be contrary to that. And it is very clear again, particularly if you read in Russian, that because of the overall political atmosphere of the time and later, he avoided being critical of Lenin. That doesn't mean to say that he wasn't critical of Lenin. I've written this, but when I spoke to one of Trotsky's major secretaries, Van Hillhead, and I asked him more or less this question. He gave me the example of a conversation that he had with Fritz Sternberg when he was present, in which Fritz Sternberg was critical of Lenin. And Trotsky said, well, you can say that, but I cannot. It's actually not very difficult to see, and I'm not a historian, but from at least one person who's worked on his stuff, so it's not difficult to see that Trotsky deliberately plays down his differences. But it's not surprising if you're going to conduct a revolution 1724 that you will not then launch a major debate with your fellow leaders, as it were, as to exactly how things should be run. Anyway, so the point I'm making is that his conception of the party was not identical to that of Lenin, and he played down exactly what it was. He didn't actually formulate it fully. Insofar as he did formulate it later in exile, in my view, it was very limited, and I personally wouldn't really know exactly how one would go further with that. That, of course, links up with the question of his particular role in supporting the revolution in 1917, and then later in his struggle against socialism in one country. Now, obviously, any Marxist must take the view that socialism in one country is a nonsense, is one of the reasons why a Stalinist cannot be a Marxist. However, the question is exactly whether a party can take power in a manner which is not democratic or wholly undemocratic, which is of course what happened in 1917. People have defended taking of power in November 1917, October 1917, by saying in some sense it was a democratic takeover. Well, it clearly wasn't. The majority of the country were peasants. and the majority of the peasantry did not support it. That was clear. It became even clearer when the Constitutional Assembly met in January 1918. The Bolsheviks only had 14%, I think, of the delegates, and they then dissolved. That's absolutely true. Among the workers, again, Lenin actually wanted to take power, ignoring the Soviet. Trotsky did. Trotsky refused to go along with it, and they waited until the Soviet met, and they got a majority in it, and then took power. Now, the question is how one looks at this whole process, because at no point can you actually say there was a fully or wholly or even a democratic process going on. It's very hard to argue. Part of what I said, but it goes further than that. Because people who have argued that Trotsky and Lenin were wrong, argued they should have remained wholly within the Soviets and waited to see what the Soviets would actually do. And then, of course, after having taken power, the Soviets were gradually ignored and effectively put on one side. Workers' committees were ignored or not used and didn't have that much influence. That's absolutely true, but that is obviously what did happen. Well, the question is how one actually looks at that. In the first instance, it's not quite so simple. One can't just say workers' committees were democratic. Well, they weren't, in fact. They weren't the kind of elections that we have today. That doesn't mean to say they have no importance, but in the conditions of the time, it was very hard to conduct the kind of election we have today. In other words, they were influenced by a series of different factors, and people could be elected on God knows what grounds. I'm not arguing that they should have been ignored. I'm simply pointing out, if one's looking at it in purely democratic terms, you couldn't say that they were necessarily representative of the working class as a whole. The second point, which goes along with that, and then make the other point in relation to the question of taking power, is that in the conditions of the time, the question is exactly what one would have wanted to do. It is, of course, an axiom of Marxism that one is talking of the self-emancipation of the proletariat. Well, how? How does the proletariat take power? Does it simply take power without any understanding beyond that? That to me is a mystical concept. There has to be a form by which it takes power. There has to be a party which has to call parties. Doesn't have to be one party, but parties which are actually leading it. If that doesn't happen, it will not happen at all. If there's no party leading it, nothing will happen. And we know that is the case. Because you can just look at the last 100 years. How many times has the proletariat not risen and been defeated or disintegrated? How many times have there not been Soviets of different kinds, workers' councils, which went nowhere? And you can think of a few recent examples in South America, in Albania, where you virtually had Soviets and nothing happened. The West just came in and took it over. There has to be a leadership. There has to be a party leadership. In principle, I mean, if we're talking today, in my view, it has to be wholly democratic. At the time, that kind of democracy would have been very unlikely. Partly because of the disintegration, the whole disintegration process, the difficulties of organization at the time, and partly because that kind of democracy didn't exist anywhere at any point. Remember, in Britain, the form of democracy we have today only comes to being in 1928, when all females get the vote. And remember, when the revolution took place in 1917, the majority of people in Britain didn't have the vote. In Germany, the parliament was still subordinated to the Kaiser. In the United States, actually women did not have the vote. So you're talking of a situation, the kind of democratic forms which now did not exist there. You're also talking of a situation of war, when millions were being killed, if you remember, everybody does remember. I think it was that context Trotsky explicitly in his book, Terrorism and Communism, raises that issue, this issue we're just talking about, and says, well, if we'd had the time, we would let the Constituent Assembly go on, because of course they dissolved. We would have let it go on, we would have let it govern, and it would then have exposed itself. And we could have gone from there. But we didn't have the time. He's partly speaking of the war, the need to end the war, and he's partly talking of the fact that the Russian Empire was in dissolution, the bourgeoisie itself was greatly weakened, it was possible to take power, and therefore they thought they ought to take power. Which raises a more general question. If the proletariat is going to take power, will the bourgeoisie go to the moon, or will it not try and maintain itself? Obviously it will maintain itself. You cannot take power when the bourgeoisie is itself strong, unless you have an equal strength on the other side. So in other words, at that point, you are talking about needing to take the advantage of the weakness of the bourgeoisie and your own strength. I think it was in that kind of context that you're talking of taking of power in this particular way, which, as I said, obviously wasn't a democratic form. Having done so, and then having won the war, they in fact had lost internationally, and there was no hope after that, unless there was a revolution.
Hillel, could you finish up shortly now, the next minute or so?
Okay. Okay, well, the final point is, Trotsky, of course, then refused to take power by himself, which he could easily have done as the head of the Red Army, and of course, with the respect that he had, and effectively was exiled and killed. But he remained the pole of attraction in the world as the person and the grouping which was able to say social one country is impossible, a new social group has taken power there, what exists there is not socialism. His conception of worker state, in my view, was flawed, was internally contradictory, and unlike the SPGB, I don't regard it as state capitalist. In a certain sense, I regard it in both a moral and a real sense as far worse than that. It wasn't socialist and it wasn't capitalist. And I've spent a lot of time, my whole life, trying to work out the way it actually works. But it does appear to me, in that respect, Trotsky was only beginning this process. And so when he says the nature of the Soviet Union is undetermined, that is the way we should actually see it. But he remained a beacon of hope, one of the few beacons of hope standing for socialism. Thank you.
In order to expedite matters, no talk from me, Adam Buick on behalf of the Socialist Party.
Right. Did Trotsky point the way to socialism? I want to reply on behalf of the Socialist Party. No, he didn't. And what he pointed the way towards was state capitalism. But first of all, if we're going to have a debate on whether somebody points the way to socialism or not, we need to define our terms. And of course, the key term to define here is socialism. So what is socialism? I think one good way to understand what socialism is to see it as the opposite of capitalism, the society we've got today. Now, capitalism is, for a start, a class society. It's class-based. It's divided into classes, where a tiny minority of the population own and control the means of wealth production, either directly as individuals or through companies and corporations or through the state. That's the basis of capitalism, and this tiny minority is in a privileged position with regard to the control of means of production, but also in regard to consumption. Now, socialism, by contrast, will be a classless society. In socialism, everybody will stand in the same relationship with regard to the control of the means of wealth production. Everybody will have equal say in the way in which society is run. That's a basic feature of socialism, as compared with capitalism. Capitalism is based on class ownership. Socialism is based on common ownership and democratic control. Now, another feature of capitalism, which everybody accepts, even those that support the capitalist system, is that it's a system of production for profit. In other words, if you like, an alternative name for capitalism is the profit system. The basic economic law of capitalism is no profit, no production. But this has all sorts of consequences. First of all, it means that production stops at the point at which it ceases to be profitable. So capitalism is a system of artificial scarcity. It also results in waste of various capitalist institutions and in a distortion. The people who've got money can have their whims satisfied, while people who in desperate need of something don't get them satisfied. Now socialism, on the other hand, will be a system of production for use. In other words, in a socialist system of society, we'll grow food for people to eat, we'll build houses for people to live in, we'll construct railways and roads for people to get from A to B. That's what socialism is. It's a system of production geared to satisfying people's needs, and not a system of production for the market with a view to profit. Now the other feature of socialism, or capitalism, which is linked up with the last one, is that in order to survive in capitalism, you have to get money. Well, basically there are about 3 or 4 ways of getting money. I mean, the easiest and the best way is to inherit it. But if you're not in that position, then you've either got to beg for money, or you've got to steal it, or you've got to go out onto the labour market and try to sell your ability to work for a wage or a salary. And that's what most people have to do. But of course, the amount of goods and services you can consume is restricted by the size of your wage packet or by the size of your salary check. In other words, it's a system of rationing. Now, the basic rule of capitalism, another basic rule of capitalism is can't have, or can't pay, can't have. Now, by contrast, socialism is a system of production to satisfy people's needs, where people have free access to what they need in accordance with the principle from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. And everything will be free: free transport, free housing, free electricity. That's what socialism means as compared with capitalism. Of course, it means there's no money, there's no wages, and there's no market. But there is one thing which both capitalism and socialism have in common, and that is capitalism is already a worldwide system of society, so that socialism, which is going to take over from capitalism and is going to build on what capitalism has built up, has to be a worldwide system of society. I entirely agree that the idea of socialism in one country is preposterous. So that's what socialism is. It's a system of common ownership and democratic control with production to satisfy people's needs. It's a worldwide system, moneyless, wageless, and classless. Now, did Trotsky stand for that system of society? I've been reading through some of the articles which Hillel wrote for a magazine or paper called The Weekly Worker. And I was surprised to see that he agrees with this definition of socialism. He calls it socialism. He doesn't call it communism. In fact, what's even more surprising is that he says that there's no distinction between socialism and communism. Now this is surprising for me anyway, because the rejection of any distinction between socialism and communism has been the one thing which has distinguished the SPGB from all Leninist groups, not just Trotskyists, but Maoists, Castroists, followers of Che Guevara, who all make this distinction between socialism and communism. And I think that Trotsky did too. I mean, this distinction was introduced by Lenin, who, just before the Bolshevik Party took power, people said to him, "You're mad. You want to establish socialism in Russia? It's impossible. It's a backward country. We can't have production directive use. We can't abolish money. We can't abolish the state." And Lenin said, no, you've got it wrong. We don't want to establish communism. That's communism. What we want to establish is socialism. And he redefined socialism to mean, this is in The State and Revolution, it's a society where all the means of production are owned by the state, where everybody becomes an employee of the state, and where everybody is paid equal wage. Now that was the position, the same position that Trotsky accepted. He agreed with Lenin that society cannot pass directly from capitalism to socialism or socialism and communism. It had to pass through this transitional society, which in fact, if you analyse it, is some sort of utopian state capitalism. So if in fact Hillel accepts that you can pass straight from capitalism to socialism, communism, then he's already rejected one of the ways which Trotsky pointed to try and get to socialism with or without inverted commas. So it's had to pass through state capitalism. Anyway, what is the way which we say, in which socialism, what is the way to socialism according to us? Well, we say that socialism can only be established through the democratic political action of the working class. And once again, we need to define what we mean by the terms. The first term, of course, is working class. And as far as we're concerned, the working class is composed of all those who don't own and control the means of wealth production, who are therefore forced by economic necessity to go out and try and find unemployed, to sell their ability to work, try and sell their ability to work for a wage or a salary. And in a country like Britain, or a part of the world like Britain, this is the vast majority of the population, over 90% of the population. So as far as we're concerned, the agent for social change is nearly everybody. Political action. Well, this is action aimed at winning control of political power, the winning control over the state machine, over the machine of government. That must be the way forward. Of course, that implies that the workers, once they become socialists, should organise into a socialist political party. The democratic political action. What we mean by democratic, in both senses of the term. First of all, that it has to be the will of the majority. It has to be what the majority of people want and understand. We also use it in the second sense, that the methods employed to get to socialism must also be democratic. And this means that the socialist political party must be organised, open democratic party. This is a disagreement which will probably come out in the debate, without a leader and without a leadership group. It must be a democratic party under the control of the members. So, and also, of course, we use the word democratic in the sense that it can be used, democratic methods, to gain control over the state machine, to gain control of political power. Because you can use the institutions of political democracy which have grown up partly through the struggles of workers in the past. In other words, the ballot box, elections and parliament. So we say once the majority of people want socialism, the balance of forces, if you like, between the working class and the minority capitalist class has changed, and they can use these institutions, or we can use these institutions, to gain control of political power. So that's the way that we're advocating to socialism. Democratic political action by the working class based on socialist understanding. Well, what about Trotsky? Well, if I can change the words of a song we used to sing in the Labour Party youth movement, Trotsky was a Bolshevik. He wasn't from the start, as has been pointed out. When Lenin, in his notorious pamphlet, What Is to Be Done, put forward this outrageous view that the working class is only capable of reaching a trade union consciousness, and that socialist ideas have to be brought to the workers by a vanguard elite of intellectuals. Trotsky joined the chorus of those who said, this isn't socialism, this isn't Marxism, it's Blankism, it's Jacobinism. And Trotsky, as has been pointed out, only joined the Bolshevik Party in 1917. And you can make what you will of this. He only joined it when he saw it had a prospect of winning control of political power. And Trotsky, as has been said, played a leading role in the Bolshevik coup d'etat of November 1917, and for 6 or 7 years after that, he was a leading member of the Bolshevik government. Now, we could go into the details of his record as a member of the Bolshevik government during that period, but it's the suppression of the concentrate uprising, the militarization of trade unions, and various other anti-working class measures which the Bolshevik government took. But I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to argue that Trotsky thought that the way to socialism in Britain, or in an advanced country like Britain, was the same as it was in Russia in 1917. I'm going to take what Trotsky himself said. In 1925, he wrote a pamphlet called Where is Britain Going? And in here, he says, first of all, that Britain is a country that's been ripe for socialism for many times. His political judgment, incidentally, wasn't all that good, because he says that Britain is heading rapidly towards a period of civil war and revolutionary upheaval. But the way he sees socialism coming about in here is through the election of what he calls a real Labour government. What does he mean by a real Labour government?
I'm trying to wind up next minute, so.
Oh dear, okay. What does he mean by a real Labour government? He means one based on the trade unions, but was led by a political group. Now he studied what political group controlled the Labour Party at that time, and it was the Independent Labour Party. Most of the members of Parliament, including Ramsay MacDonald himself, most of the members of the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party were members of the ILP. Now Trotsky's solution was, if only this ILP was replaced by the Communist Party, then that would be all right. That would be the way in which socialism would come about. And that has been the policy of Trotskyist groups ever since, to try to build up a Labour Party and try to win a leading position into it. Now we say that that is not the way in which socialism will come about. It won't come about through a party based on trade unions led by a vanguard party.
Okay, how long? 10 minutes, okay?
Okay, well, I've got some idea what the point is there. Well, it's clear, I don't disagree on the conception of socialism, except that I would add to it that Marx says it's a social society, a society in which labour becomes mankind's prime one.
You speak up a little, Ewan. A lot of deaf people here.
Okay, I said I don't disagree with the conception of socialism. And Adam has said that he was surprised that I regarded socialism and communism as the same thing. Well, if you read Marx, that's very clear, no doubt. That's what he's referring to. Now, why I disagree with him is that distinction was actually specifically made by Lenin, adopted by Trotsky, and they specifically saw a separate state capitalist period. Well, I can't remember the state revolution itself, so I can't argue about the text there. I have actually, but I have read what Lenin and Trotsky were writing in the period of 17 to 23, and I've read quite a bit of it in Russian, quite a bit of what I've read, not everything that has appeared, which is far too much anyway. And one thing that is clear is when they use socialism there as applying to the Soviet Union, when I've read it, no doubt there were other cases where the printer didn't put it in, there are inverted commas. And sometimes they make it clear that it isn't socialism. That the word there being used isn't meant to really mean socialism as it has historically been understood by Marx or Marx, and they don't really mean it as socialism. Now that actually is very clear if you read through it. Secondly, if you look at how Lenin defines, and Trotsky is not very different, how does Lenin define what existed by 1920-21? He says it is state capitalism. Exactly, apparently, what your program is. He calls it state capitalism. He is very firm that it actually isn't socialist. Specifically, the party Congress calls it state capitalist. And for him, that was because particularly after 21, you have more extensive private enterprise. You have on the one hand the state apparatus held by the Communist Party. On the other hand, you have a capitalist framework. And that's what he says. It's different, I think, from the SPGB and other viewpoints of state capitalism, which generally fuse the two, arguing the state itself is capitalist effectively, or operating as capitalism. He's seeing them as separate, because the Communist Party actually holds a state, and therefore, the possibility, therefore, of the Communist Party being able to go from there to a society in transition to a socialist society. But Lenin and Trotsky never thought they could build socialism in one country or in Russia at that time. They were absolutely explicit at the time. I've read it 101 times saying, why did Lenin go into Poland? Not in order to conquer Poland. It's not that he cared or didn't care about Poland. He wanted to say he didn't care tons about Poland. He was trying to get to Germany. Why was he trying to get to Germany? In order to assist the revolution in Germany. It was absolutely desperate acting. He makes it clear it was desperate. Trotsky was opposed to it, but that was why. They knew they couldn't succeed. They were absolutely clear, 101% they couldn't succeed in Russia by itself. They weren't trying to construct socialism. They knew that. Now I know there are various Stalinists, like my former colleagues in the Institute of, what was the Institute of Soviet Studies, who have been trying to argue that Lenin was a Stalinist. That's just nonsense. And even trying to adapt Trotsky, that's 100% not nonsense. Neither Lenin nor Trotsky ever thought they could build very much in socialist terms. That didn't stop them trying to build up the country or introduce aspects which were better than might have existed under capitalism, which sometimes could be called socialist with quotation marks. The militarization of labor, which was introduced actually the support of Lenin, not just Trotsky, and then changed his mind, wasn't anything to do with socialism or non-socialism. The population was starving, for God's sake. There was no industry, wasn't working. It was down to 13% of what it was. The Labour government in this country proposed exactly the same thing in 1947. What he was talking about was running factories under control. In this case, it was the control of the trade unions, and discipline so that they could get things going as a temporary measure. That has nothing to do with socialism or non-socialism. Under conditions where people are starving, conditions of the war wasn't wholly finished, and so on, that is all it meant. An attempt to maintain the economy going, and there was no other way to actually do it successfully except by direction. Certainly it wasn't socialist, but they didn't claim it to be socialist. They weren't saying we are socialists doing this. They're saying we are trying to survive in order that we can act as a point of attraction so that for socialism, so that we can, not in terms of the society itself, which couldn't be a point of attraction, but as a means so that we can support a revolution in Germany. That's basically what they were saying. They were holding on in order to assist the revolution throughout the world. They're absolutely clear about that. They didn't regard it as socialists. Now, the final point is, I think, make this question of what is state capitalism. In my view, the Soviet Union, after Stalinism took over, it was in no sense capitalist, certainly not state capitalist. It never operated, using the definitions used, it never operated on the basis of profit. Profit was one of many indicators, and most times there was no profit. It was purely formal, never operated on the basis of profit. There was a term called profit, but so what? The crucial thing was whether they fulfilled the plan. The plan itself was itself dubious. That's to say, you look at the way the whole thing went, it wasn't planned either. The idea that it was capitalist planning is nonsense. It wasn't capitalism, it wasn't planning. You just go through it and read what the economists later on came to say. They didn't say at the time. Later on came to say. Did they sell their labour power? No, they couldn't sell their labour power. You had an atomized society, controlled from above. The secret police were absolutely crucial to that atomized society. And if they didn't work, they were hauled into court as parasites. And it wasn't the parasite law wasn't just a law which wasn't used. Even in the last years of Gorbachev, several hundred thousand people were taken to court for not working. There was no choice. You had to work, and you were under control. It was a series of controls on movement and on what they did. I wasn't going into all the different forms, but you want to, I could. So, to call that a society which labour power couldn't be sold, where in fact the standard of living was low, and in reality the rate of exploitation was very high, where the workers could not in any sense organize in any case, to call that capitalist is actually to say it was much better than it actually was. For any worker, it was far worse to be in the Soviet Union than even some of the worst capitalist societies, given the way it was. To call it capitalist is to misunderstand what actually existed there. It wasn't in fact a socioeconomic system like capitalism, socialism, feudalism, remote production. It was an abortive form existing in a vacuum of history. And for that reason, it will always threaten to disintegrate until it finally did disintegrate. People who regard as capitalists can't understand its process of movement, why it had to come to an end. It couldn't have lasted. As people know, I was writing that critique 20 years before it came to an end. It was obvious that that was its nature. To call it capitalist is to misunderstand how it was developing and what it actually was. There's no problem condemning it. Anybody who lived in a society condemned it anyway. This is just the unfortunate people living outside it who somehow decided, Stalinists decided to support it. You can only call them unfortunate in every respect. Anyway, it wasn't state capitalist. That doesn't give you an understanding of what it actually was. As I've just said, what follows from that is that one would be as critical as one possibly could as socialist of what existed in the Soviet Union. To call it capitalist is to miss that criticism, actually. The deep criticism which should actually have been there and often wasn't there. It's not just an abstract thing, and it wasn't brought into being by Lenin or Trotsky. The point I made earlier was that a new social group had actually taken power under Stalin. It wasn't Stalin bringing them into being. They came into being and they used Stalin. The reason for its vicious nature had to do with the fact that it couldn't become a system. The reason for the purges too are very much part of it. It was an inherently not contradictory but conflictual system with laws opposing each other. In a desperate search for some way to get the thing going, in my view, Stalin went for the purges. I think you can, if you don't adopt the state capitalist viewpoint, try and understand what was really happening, come to understand what was really happening there, why it reached such depths, and why it came to an end. Take a capitalist viewpoint, you don't understand anything at all of it, including the very obvious fact that it didn't base itself on profit. It desperately wanted to, but it couldn't do it.
1 minute.
Okay, so what I've said is that in my view, the ideals of Lenin and Trotsky were in fact the same as that of Marx. The conception of permanent revolution, Trotsky, comes directly from Marx. It's in fact a minor adaptation to it in the particular conditions. He's saying that the working class has to take power in the case of Russia or anywhere else, and from there it must take the next step towards socialism. He's saying, Marx, of course, we're talking in 1848, isn't saying anything very different. So, and the ideals of socialism, or the program of socialism, is that of communism. And in their mind and in their actions, I think, they saw it as that. But they were constricted within the operations of the bourgeoisie, the civil war, the wars, and so on. Thank you.
Well, if I was a Trotskyist, if I was a member of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, which still exists, or the Spartacus League, I wouldn't regard Hillel as a Trotskyist. I think he was a revisionist and a reviser of Trotsky's views, because not only has he rejected the distinction, the false distinction between socialism and communism that was made by Lenin and Trotsky, but he's also admitted the point which we've always made, that Russia after 1917 was, to start with, state capitalist. Now, I've not read Trotsky in Russian, but I've never found any mention in any of Trotsky's writings that have been translated where he did describe Russia after 1917 as state capitalist. Now, it's quite true that neither Lenin nor Trotsky regarded Russia in that period as being socialist, but they certainly believed that what Russia was doing was building socialism. I mean, if you read this book, Trotsky's book, The Revolution Betrayed, which came out in 1936, you will see references there. Well, these are quotes. I can give the page number, to the socialist state in Russia, to socialist industries in Russia, to socialist industrialization in Russia, and to socialist accumulation in Russia. And it's quite clear that although they didn't think it was socialism, they thought it was on the way to socialism. But it all follows, as I say, from this false distinction which Lenin made between socialism and communism. And I'll quote here how Lenin describes this. This is in 1917, before the Bolshevik Party took power. He says that what they're going to establish is not communism, because that's impossible according to him. What they're going to establish is a state where all citizens are transformed into hired employees of the state, which consists of the armed workers. All citizens become employees and workers of a single nationwide syndicate, and all that is required is that they work equally, do their proper share of work, and get equally paid. So that's quite clear that in this society, which they call socialism, there's going to be the state and there's going to be money. And in The Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky says, yes, of course there's going to be the state, and of course there's going to be money. He says that these two problems, state and money, have a number of traits in common, but they both reduce themselves in the last analysis to the problem of problems, productivity of labour. State compulsion, like money compulsion, is an inheritance from class society, which is incapable of defining the relations of man by man except in the form of fetishes, churchly or secular, after appointing to defend them the most alarming of all fetishes, the state. And then he goes on to say, such characteristically anarchist demands as the abolition of money, abolition of wages, and liquidation of the state and family possess interest merely as models of mechanical thinking. He says, in fact, you have to have the state to force people to work, and you have to have money as an incentive for people to work. And as a matter of fact, he argues that the money in Russia, socialist money, has to be based on gold. So, this is the argument. What did Trotsky see as socialism? The point of debate is, did Trotsky point the way to socialism? I say that Trotsky didn't point the way to socialism, he pointed the way to state capitalism. Now, personally, I'm not concerned with what you call Russia, as long as you don't call it socialist. I mean, I think, in fact, it happens to be state capitalist because it was based on wage labour. The same situation existed as here. A tiny minority of the population owned and controlled the means of production, the nomenclature, the top people in the Communist Party and so on. And the rest of the population were excluded and had to work for a wage or a salary. So I think, in fact, Russia was certainly a class society, and I think it was a state capitalist society. But that wasn't Trotsky's view. I mean, Trotsky held the view that Russia was some sort of workers' state. I mean, he says it's the nationalization of the land, the means of industrial production, transport and exchange, together with the monopoly of foreign trade, constitute the basis of the Soviet social structure. Through these relations established by the proletarian revolution, the nature of the Soviet Union as a proletarian state is basically defined. Well, because to describe Russia in the 1930s, 40s and 50s as a worker state is just absurd. How can it be a worker state where the workers don't even have the vote, where the workers are excluded from any decision making, and where they have to work for for a wage or a salary? So once again, come back to the thing, what is the way to socialism? I mean, the way to socialism is not through state capitalism, and it's not through armed insurrection. It's not, as I was saying at the end of my first contribution, it's not through electing a party based on trade unions and led by some sort of elite. It's, as I was saying before, the way to socialism, first of all, is people have got to understand what socialism is, and it's a system, as I said, based on the common ownership and the democratic control of the means of production, where there's no money, there's no market, there's no working for wages, and where the principle, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. People must want and understand it. The majority of people, the overwhelming majority of people, must want and understand that type of society. Once you've got that, you're more than halfway there, because from that point on, it's a technical matter of how you get there. In countries like Britain and most of North America and Western Europe and other parts of the world as well, the means are there. It's the ballot box. People, instead of electing and sending to Parliament Labour, Tory, Liberal and other capitalist politicians, they send socialist delegates there to take over the state, and then they just declare all private property rights, all title deeds, these are all null and void. From now on, all the means of production belong in common to the whole of society. And from that point on, it's a question of organisation, democratic organisation, to produce things purely and simply for use. That is the way to socialism. It's not through leadership, it's not through some sort of minority action, it's through democratic, conscious majority action. That's the way to socialism. And Trotsky never accepted that. Trotsky, in fact, specifically rejected that on a number of occasions. And in fact, Hillel is a Trotskyist to that extent, because he's explained every failure to establish socialism up to now by the failure of having leadership. I mean, Trotsky wrote something about the Paris Commune. Why did the Paris Commune fail? Because there wasn't a vanguard party, and that's been kept up by Trotskyists ever since. Why did something? Well, you may mention Albania, you mention Germany, you mention Hungary. All these, the Trotskyist explanation is all these failed because there wasn't leadership. And in fact, they failed because the majority of workers didn't want and understand socialism. They were deeply discontented, wanted to overthrow the regime in place, but they didn't want to establish socialism. So that's the reason why these things failed. I'll repeat in summing up. The way to socialism is through democratic political action on the part of the working class.